Hello again. Um, so we're going to look a little bit more at science fiction. Kind of, if we think back to some of the major constituent parts that go into fiction, like character, plot, setting, etc. Argon. Think back to 130, especially if you had it with me, and how I outlined these concepts. Argon. If you didn't, some of you I know didn't take. Actually, one of you, at least in this class, didn't take a 130 with me. When we're talking about fiction, and this is very different from poetry. Poetry has different concerns, different things it needs to do to function as a poem. But in fiction, the idea is that we're constellating all of the character, the setting, the plot, the narrative or narration. We're constellating all of those around points of agon to remind you. Agon being conflict, because if we don't have conflict in our stories, science fiction, fiction, it doesn't matter. Without conflict, the stories don't work. They're not going to be good. Nobody's going to want to read them. Because if you think of a good story that you've read or a good book, and it's focused on this idea of complications, of danger, right? So this idea of agon or conflict is central to fiction. You can't write a good story without it. Now the conflicts, I think I did a whole video on this for another class for 130, I believe. The agon or conflict can be external and internal, right? Because the character has a flaw, right, that they are trying to overcome. In the struggle to overcome the interior conflict, right? This is how we get character development. They move through the world, they struggle, etc. So there's your external conflict. Let's say that, uh, uh, well, here's an easy one, or not easy, but one that comes to mind. In Thomas Hardy's book, Jude the Obscure, it's a merciless book. My goodness, it is. It's the last book that Hardy wrote. He was a very famous novelist in his day, but it was the last novel that he wrote before he turned exclusively to poetry. And it's about as bleak a book as you could possibly read. Uh, Spoiler alert: there's a note that one of his children leaves for him, um, and all it says is "because we are too many," and he misspells "many" as Menny. It I won't tell you what it's regarding, but my goodness, it's bleak. So anyway, Jude is born into it's set in England, and so back at that time, the class system was very very rigid. If you were born in a lower class, you could not hope to ascend higher than your station. And you can kind of see a little bit of that even in Britain today, because there are so many accents in Britain, and each accent would kind of distinguish which class you were from. That's why, if you pay attention to it, you can start to learn these. But anyway, Jude, this character, is born into a low class. He is poor, and he's ambitious. He's intelligent. He teaches himself Latin, and because he wants to go to university and be a man of letters. The no university will allow him uh, to join because, well, he's just not connected. He doesn't have those that pedigree and that background. So his internal conflict, right, to get an education, to be a better person, right, puts him in all kinds of uh, conflicts. And so there's the conflict of love that shows up in the story. There's the conflict of loss. There's the conflict of marrying the wrong person, as he does initially. There's the conflict of finding love. He ends up living. He's His first wife won't grant him a divorce, so even though she's left him. So he's technically still married, um, and is living in sin with this woman, with whom he has some children. And but at that time, that was like so taboo, like you just couldn't do it. So you see, there's a conflict. There's an external conflict, and there's the internal conflicts in that book, and it eventually just consumes the poor guy. So anyway, just to kind of show you that, okay. Or think of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. You know, Raskolnikov. Um, he has this internal conflict because he thinks that he's a great man. He's going on this idea, kind of borrowed from Hegel, of the great person, the great man, and he thinks he is above all humanity and therefore not necessarily subject to humanity's laws. And he ends up killing this old woman, um, and his conscience, his internal conflict, gets the better of him. It's a really interesting book. It's probably Dostoevsky's most famous one, although I don't think it's his best. The Brothers Karamazov, that's his best book. Go read it. Anyway, so back to science fiction. So we have to have conflict, conflict, conflict. Okay. So let's look at. Oops. Let me switch this around. Okay. So ideas, generating ideas in science fiction. Remember that it's just as hard or just as easy to generate ideas for science fiction and fantasy as it is for normal fiction. And I say normal there a bit tongue in cheek because a lot of literary scholars kind of look down upon science fiction and fantasy as a genre. They think, oh, well, it's just for kids. And it's not. It's a very, very philosophically engaging genre, and it should not be thought of as like a substandard genre. It's just a subgenre. Literary fiction is a subgenre of fiction. Okay, so if we start to think of like what do humans desire, right? Now we're getting into intention. We're starting to build a character that will give us our plot, and then once we have that, then we can start to develop setting. We can then start to develop the world once we have that setting. So you see, these organically kind of flow from each other. And it's not necessarily that you have to start your story in this way or start thinking about it in this way. This is just one easy way to do it. Human beings desire money, power, sex, love. We desire community. We desire all of these things. We desire happiness. Human beings have a lot of desires, but our desires are limited because, well, human beings are not gods. We are not, we don't have an infinite number of desires. We're actually pretty simple in a lot of ways. For example, Plato and Aristotle asked that question many times. You know, what drives human beings? Because in order to understand what it means to be human, we have to understand what motivates people. And sometimes it's the wrong motivations, right? Sometimes our motivation centers get a little bit scrambled. Now, Aristotle answers this question, what do people want? And he says happiness, eudaimonia. And it doesn't quite translate to happiness, but close enough. We can look back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we can see back there, what motivates Gilgamesh. At first, it's a desire to live forever, right? That is his motivation. He eventually sort of almost gets his wish, but then he's gone on a spiritual journey. So we have external and internal conflicts in that book. It's a really great book. It's short. Go read it. So we have the external and internal, and he resolves the internal conflict by becoming a good king. Okay? He what started as a physical journey becomes a spiritual journey by the end. Aristotle said that happiness is the thing that we want for its own sake. Okay, we can't say, "Oh, I want money because money will make me happy." You see, money there is a means to happiness. We want X because we want to get to Y, or to get to Z. Okay, so Aristotle would say that happiness itself is the thing that we want for its own sake. If we're saying like, oh, I want those shoes will make me happy, this physical material thing, we're still talking about means to an end and not the end. Okay. Let's think about people who want status. Okay, through something like power or money. Power over the physical world, over other people. That's a gigantic central theme in a lot of science fiction, and especially like dystopian books or post-apocalyptic books, which are a lot of fun as a genre. Now, status is something that is nice. It's nice and loosely defined, and that gives us kind of a little bit of wiggle room and ambiguity if we're using that as a theme to develop a character and setting and all of that and plot, because status can come from a lot of things. Okay, we can say that power or money generates status, but also like your job can generate status, where you're from can generate status. So there's all kinds of ways we can do this. Now, it's very common in human endeavors because human beings are this very, very strange primate. And we are self conscious of ourselves as individuals. And very few animals on this planet have that self awareness. I think it's a couple types of crow or corvid. I want to say the New Caledonia crow, and maybe, I don't think magpies can. Dolphins exhibit it. Chimpanzees can. I don't think gorillas do. Humans, obviously. Elephants do. They have a little test. Some dogs can actually do it. So anyway, so we're self-conscious of ourselves as individuals, but we're also incredibly social, right? Human beings are very, very social creatures. So we have this weird mixture. So we're this hierarchical primate, right? Who we try to dominate others and all of this for status, and yet we are incredibly altruistic and social. On the other hand, there's this weird conflict that we find in this. But anyway, let's think of status, okay, in science fiction. Let's see what we get with this, okay? Now, in fiction, if we're trying to build status as a theme or a character motivation, okay, remember that in fiction, you have to think of everything in fiction as a zero-sum game, okay? A lot of you, especially in your like early drafts, you're just too nice, and you're thinking too much like a normal person. If you're thinking about the world as a fictional thing, okay, something we're approaching as a writer, always think of it as a zero-sum game. That is to say, if you don't know what a zero-sum game means, it's basically this. Something that is taken from somebody else, right, results in that loss, right? There's a finite amount of stuff going around. And status, we take it away from somebody else and we gain that status. It's similar to this. I just didn't spell it out in Greek, but that's not time. It's time and kleos. Okay, time in Greek means honor, or it can mean the prizes that you get, like from, or it means basically the stuff that you gain by taking it from others. Okay, and kleos means, it doesn't. I repeated this word here mistakenly. Kleos means sort of like lasting glory. So in order to get kleos, right, we have to take it from somebody else. So if you go read the Iliad, you'll see that when they go into battles, each warrior starts talking about who they are. I am so-and-so, I'm Glaucon, and blah, blah, blah. My grandfather was blah, blah, and I am Diomedes, and my grandfather was... And so they're talking about basically establishing their honor, right, or their social value, so that when somebody loses the battle, effectively they are taking that status. Okay, they're taking that glory from that other person, and that becomes them. That's why everybody's stealing each other's armor. Um, well, the ironic system is that in those books in the Greek culture itself, immortality comes only from killing or being killed, right? That's the one of the central ironies of that book. Achilles kind of realizes this at one point, and that's why he sits brooding in his tent for most of the book. Now, there always has to be a limited amount of power, status, whatever that motivation, love, whatever that motivation is in your story. Okay, there has to be a limited amount of it, especially in fiction. I mean, I'm not talking about the real world, because, for example, if diamonds are common, okay, then they're not important, right? We're talking about scarcity, scarcity of resources. Okay, so even if it's love that you're using as the primary motivation or thematic element in the story, it has to be limited, okay? Or it has to be troubled. It has to be problematic. There has to be agon. There has to be conflict involved with it. Okay, the scarcity is what makes things important. Okay, scarcity of trust. If we live in a world where it's impossible to trust others, right? Then that trust becomes the valuable asset. Okay, think of a book like George Orwell's 1984, where the government is always watching you, right? You don't know whom you can trust. Everybody might be a double agent. So privacy is scarce. Trust is scarce. Even if you go read that book, truth is scarce, because, as Orwell says in the English language, he says that whoever controls language controls thought, and that's true. So we're just establishing, we're thinking about the rules of society. We're thinking about the background setting, right? In order to motivate the character, they have to have motivations based on human intentions. And then that helps us to understand what the world is like in which they're operating. Because in science fiction, most often, or fantasy, the world where your characters are inhabiting is similar to ours, but different. Okay, and we have to be able to establish how it's different. That sets up our rules. We'll talk about that here in a bit. What's called the zero world. Okay, so we can understand how that works. Now, in normal fiction, okay, the characters are working in an established world that the reader already understands. Okay, they are bound by normal human emotions, normal human intentions, physics, and all of that. Okay. Technology, you name it, okay? When you set up the basic rules for your world that you're writing about, so dogs can talk, mushrooms are currency, social media isn't a waste of time, right? These things that aren't real, okay? We have to bring that into the reader's mind fairly early, usually first page, second page, third page, depending on how long your book is. But you have to establish what that looks like, okay? If we think about normal science, okay, let's think about Einstein, okay? He basically established that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, okay? 186,000 meters per second. And so in science fiction, for example, like Star Trek or whatever, people can. There's faster than life or faster than light warp drives. Now, there's a lot of speculation as to how these could work. Are we creating wormholes? How are we bending space time and all of that? And we just can't do it, right? Because if you have mass, you can't it would take an infinite amount of energy to travel at the speed of light, and we can't generate an infinite amount of energy. So what they do in science fiction, okay, is you want to establish these technologies or these capabilities, the same with fiction, or same with fantasy and fiction. We want to get that on the page as soon as possible. Okay, I did this silly, sentence here. Sarah jumped into her hypercar, turned on the hyperdrive, and sped off to the nearest galaxy to meet her boyfriend. Ha ha ha. But there, I'm at least getting those things in there, that we have something called a hypercar, there's something called a hyperdrive, and you can drive to the nearest galaxy somehow, okay, to meet up with somebody, which doesn't make any sense, right? We're talking traveling light years in amount of time it would take you to drive across town, okay? This is just something that you have to get used to when you're writing science fiction or fantasy. Okay, if there's magic, you have to establish that magic is a thing. You have to show the reader how that works. How do these rules work? Okay. Once you establish that believable world, now it can be fantastic, of course, right? But the rules have to remain consistent. If human status is the driving theme that you want to work with, wonderful. But that has to remain consistent, okay? Here, I just said, let's start with the setting. And I just made up New Soul, okay? That implies what? That there was an old soul. There was no pun intended there. I created some of these lectures while I was teaching in Korea. But that establishes history, that establishes a timeline, that establishes that kind of thickness of the narrative, implying that there's a continuum upon which the story is taking place. Okay, that idea of when is very, very important for science fiction and fantasy. Okay. Any technologies, any rules, any magic, anything that's going to come up in your story should be established very early on. And there have to be limitations, okay? There can't be, an infinite amount of something. That's why we're talking about zero-sum games earlier, because if there's an infinite amount of something, the conflicts become different. And then they become more complex. If you think about, for example, Star Trek, okay? Now, I haven't watched the newer ones. I think there's another one that came out a year or two ago. I haven't watched it. But in that, one of the premises is that they have solved the problem of energy, okay? Because if you think about human beings right now, what are our conflicts a lot of the time, country to country, based on? They're based on resources, and primarily in the modern age, it's about access to oil, because oil and fossil fuels, petroleum products, plastics, right, drive entire economies. Think about everything around you right now. Look at all the plastic, okay? If you live in a relatively modern house that has particle board in it, in the subflooring or the roof, those have petroleum in them, as glue. And a lot of glues have petroleum. I mean, it's incredible how much petroleum goes into stuff. So our wars are all based on access to resources, okay? So what they did in Star Trek was they removed that need, and they made a different set of statuses, you might say, okay? They made a different set of motivations. So no longer are we at war over resources. There are different kinds of resources that show is emphasizing. So those resources can be cultural, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in terms of getting or setting your world, explaining how it works, that's all exposition. And exposition is hard. Exposition is tricky to control, okay? And it can be done most easily, and you've heard me say this several times, but it can be done most easily in normal fiction through conversation. In science fiction and fantasy, we do have a little bit more leeway. There's kind of rules built into how exposition can work in these genres, because it's more permissible or allowable, um, to have the narration or the narrator slow the story down and explain how things work, or demonstrate them. Okay, so um, let's say, for example, here's part of the exposition. Here's part of our setting. Okay, there's been a catastrophic global war. How do we, for example, open a story? Right? How do we open a story, um, explaining that there has been a catastrophic global war? Now, in a movie, all you'd have to do is just put a camera up there and film, some destroyed buildings, show a nuclear bomb going off. You can visually catch that very, very quickly. In fiction, it takes a lot more time. Okay, we want to give the reader a sense of the duration, right? Time, that thickness of the narrative, the temporal narration. That's something that's very valuable, and it gives your story an extra bit of gravity or weight. We could open up with a secondary character reading a newspaper about a recent conflict. Perhaps their job is related tangentially to the war. Perhaps their child comes in and reports something they learned in school, or something that they saw out in the wasteland, right? Your secondary characters can be your exposition in science fiction and fantasy. They could be the ones who come in and kind of fill in the gaps, okay, through conversation. Hey, Dad, I just saw a mutant running down the street. You wouldn't believe it. They had a fresh hot dog in their hand. And that's going to subtly demonstrate certain things, that there are mutants, maybe that we're looking at a wasteland, and that hot dogs, or maybe food, are very rare. Okay, that's exposition. That has to be established very early in the story for science fiction and fantasy. It's a rule. You can't keep surprising the reader later with new rules, new technologies, new magics that haven't been established. It's too Deus Ex Machina. George R. R. Martin, who did the Game of Thrones books, is very good at this. Okay, he's very good at establishing exposition. A lot of that comes through dialogue. Okay, like I said, that helps us to establish setting. Okay, the setting helps to establish characters, because once we know the setting, okay, and this is like I said, it kind of works back and forth. If you're thinking about the character, trying to build the character, that gives you the plot, which allows you to kind of establish setting. It can work in reverse, right? The setting is going to give us characters, because the setting is going to set up the possibilities for the conflicts. Okay, if it's a post-apocalyptic world, that comes with certain rules. There's no government, there's no law. It's dog eat dog. Food might be scarce, gasoline might be scarce, energy, etc. So it establishes what the characters are limited to. Okay, and that can work back and forth like this. Okay. What's nice about science fiction, as it says here, is that it can mix the basic motivations of people, and give them also a more philosophical feel. Okay, we all want love and comfort and value and dignity and all of that, but in science fiction, it takes on a more philosophical valence, you might say. Here's a fun little opening. Here's a fun little story. This is the whole story. This is from Frederick Brown. After the last atomic war, Earth was dead. Nothing grew, nothing lived. The last man sat alone in a room. There was a knock on the door. And that's the whole story. It's just 27 words. But you see, we have we have a setting, we have a context, we have character, we have some character development, so to speak, in that the character is now being put into this quizzical state. Okay, who's knocking on the door? If there's one person in the world left, who's knocking on the door? We have, it's complete science fiction, complete fantasy, but it now has conflict. Who's knocking on that door? What's the mystery? Okay, we don't know. He doesn't resolve it, but funny little story. Here's a quick challenge, you might say, to you as a writer. Try writing a version of that in 150 words total. Okay, you could even take, just as an exercise, you could take that opening of 27 words, and then you've got 123 words left to resolve the mystery. Who's knocking on the door, right? It's always about, in fiction, trying to create more with less, okay? Excess words are not going to make your stories better. It's about learning to build interesting scenes, interesting worlds, interesting characters using fewer and fewer words by making them more accurate. So sometimes these short writing exercises can be really valuable. And that's takes us up to about 30 minutes. And so next we'll talk about the three concepts that go into science fiction and fantasy.